This episode, I'm joined once again by Bryan Counter to discuss Cormac McCarthy's novel, Suttree. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please, enjoy. So, Bryan Counter, once again, thanks for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you for having me again.
We are going to be discussing Cormac McCarthy's fourth novel, Suttree. This was published in 1979. It is semi-autobiographical. It was written by McCarthy over 20 years, so adding up the dates, he would have begun writing this novel when he was about 26, and then it's published in 79. It is a novel that follows a chap called Cornelius Suttree, who's largely just called Suttree or Sut. And he has moved, and all of this is kind of hinted at because the other novels that are really closest to Suttree in like style is Ulysses, Huckleberry Finn, Cannery Row. There's a lot going on in this novel stylistically and structurally. So in terms of me saying that the plot is following Suttree, who's come from this privileged life, who is now an outcast living in Knoxville, around all these other outcasts and alienated people, and sort of, in the language of the novel, sort of bums and, to be honest, degenerates and whores and prostitutes and these kind of Burroughs-esque people, through this journey of the young man. The novel is not linear in that sense. It is arguably, if someone had to ask me what's your favorite novel, I would. Suttree is up there alongside Moby Dick. For me, I think it is McCarthy's most accomplished book, to be honest. It is also his longest, and it deals with, death, industrialization versus nature, God versus nihilism, and just it is just unfathomably detailed and rich. So yeah. Bryan, what was when did you first read Suttree? What was your first sort of thoughts after finishing it?
So it was just about almost exactly a year ago, maybe a little bit under a year, because I remember I was on my winter break, and I remember I sent you an email when I started reading it, because it was not too long after we talked about Outer Dark, or at least it was a few months or something, and I remember near the end of that conversation, you said, "Man, you got to get on Suttree." So I put it on the top of my list. It was my kind of winter break reading. And I think I read it in 2 or 3 days. So I started reading it, and I just was reading. I mean, that's a couple hundred pages a day, which for Suttree, it's a long novel. It's also smaller font, I guess, but that's maybe testament to how engaging it is. And I think, it's up there for me too with a favorite, with one of my favorite novels. But one thing, I mean, you just were saying before we started that it's a very clear novel, and I totally agree with that. Dipping back into it, I can remember even flipping through the audiobook. As soon as he says the first few words of a chapter, I know where in the novel it is now. You know what I mean? Even though I haven't just read it. So yeah, I think that's something we can definitely touch on a bit, because that's a remarkably it's an achievement, I guess, for McCarthy.
Yeah, I think maybe that's a good place to begin, because I was saying that the first time I read Suttree, I'd read, I think it was pre Passenger and Stella Maris release. So at that point, it was close to the last McCarthy that I read. I think I read Cities of the Plain and Orchard Keeper afterwards. And I'm glad I left it till late in the day, because, if you do that, you've read some really good McCarthy, and if you're into him, you think, man, how could it get better than, Blood Meridian or Outer Dark? And then you read this and I'm consistently blown away. But the first time I read it, thinking back, I remember feeling like Suttree, feeling like I'm being dragged along through life. I'm somehow a little bit above this, as the reader, but at the same time, characters are just sort of appearing once, again, I'm estranged from seemingly everything. This is the position that McCarthy puts Suttree in, is one of terminal estrangement from, from family, from society, from career, from status, from anything he can. And you are like that as the reader, very confused and very sort of dazed in my first reading. But as I go back, much like, my second reading and reading in preparation for this chat, it is a novel of very clear set pieces. Like yourself, when I was flicking through and rereading certain sections, I went, oh, this is the diner scene, or this is the scene when Gene Harrogate kills the bats, or, this is the funeral scene. And there's a clear progression or maturation of the language which allows you to really position yourself in the life of Suttree, given, the snippet that we're given in this book. So that's a pretty, as you said, it's a pretty amazing thing. But also just this notion of set pieces, and I'm thinking of whether or not, in Outer Dark, I don't think that was as clear. You could say that maybe Child of God itself is one large set piece. Blood Meridian, maybe so, but a bit more vague. But this is and I think this is needed because the tone of various sections and various events in the novel does change quite drastically. So, of course, there's going to be spoilers in this, but to give maybe a few clear instances, it would be, one scene you're thrown into the vision of Gene Harrogate with his trousers down after just having sex with multiple watermelons in a field, for farmers shining a light on this pale-skinned bare ass in the middle of a field. And in a way, I guess McCarthy has to set borders, because that is some of the most comedic and literally laugh out loud writing I've ever read. But then there's also this absolutely literally gut-wrenching, and a scene I wanted to escape from, this whole scene of Suttree going back to the funeral of his son, not being welcome, stumbling through gardens, being chased, being hated by everyone. And so the temperament and tone of all the different scenes is so often drastically different that I guess it had to be set apart in that way. But it also is a sort of I guess a light metaphor of Suttree's own life, in the sense that, and now we're doing this, and now I'm in the bar with J-Bone and the boys, and now, I'm depressed in a bar that was 3 years ago. It's very like, now we're doing this, now we're doing this. He has not got stability in the novel.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts about a lot of what you just said. So yeah, on the one hand, Child of God, I haven't read it in a while, but I would say that, and to some extent Outer Dark too, although Outer Dark maybe less so. They do feel very much one tone or one dimension, not one-dimensional in a bad way, but it feels like McCarthy is really, especially with Child of God, kind of like painting one picture, or you're in one room, or you're, what I mean? There's one kind of feeling to the whole thing. And I think, right, like Suttree has seasons, right? Literally seasons, but they're also like affective seasons. There's this humor, there's this kind of, and that to me almost gives it, more of a quality of an epic or something like that, right? Like we have humor, we have tragedy, the best books are like this, right? But at the same time, like you said, the other novels that we could maybe compare this to, you said Ulysses. I would also say maybe Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry. There's some similarity there. It follows, one character. I would say that Under the Volcano is much more confusing and a lot harder to make heads or tails of. Suttree is like a page turner,
Mm-hmm.
like there are scenes, and I don't know exactly what it is, obviously it's because McCarthy's a great writer, but I think it's also because he's painted this character who feels totally not one-dimensional, right? He feels like even though we know this is a fictional character, he feels very much three-dimensional. He laughs, he cries, he gets drunk, he does all these different things. And it feels like a real person, and I think maybe that's part of why this book is so hard to put down. Yeah, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Where I want to begin, even though we've sort of already begun trying to frame the novel, which is difficult to do. I want to begin basically with a major theme, and with two quotes. One is just a quote, one is a short discussion. So the first quote, which is fairly well known, is how surely are the dead beyond death, Death is what the living carry with them, a state of dread, like some uncanny foretaste of a bitter memory. But the dead do not remember, and nothingness is not a curse, far from it. And then the other quote is much later on, with a discussion between Suttree and the old man, and they're talking about death, and then Suttree says, what happens then? When? After you're dead. Don't nothing happen, you're dead. You told me once you believed in God. The old man waved his hand. Maybe, he said. I got no reason to think he believes in me. Oh, I'd like to see him for a minute, if I could. What would you say to him? Well, I think I'd just tell him. I'd say, wait a minute. Wait just 1 minute before you start in on me. Before you say anything, there's just one thing I'd like to know. And he'll say, what's that? And then I'm going to ask him, what did you have me in that crap game down there for anyway? I couldn't put any part of it together. Suttree smiled. What do you think he'll say? The rag picker spat and wiped his mouth. I don't believe he can answer it. I don't believe there is an answer. And so McCarthy, he does this in a lot of his books, right? He often is explicit about characters who absolutely don't believe in a meaning of existence, and basically nihilists of this very immanent, common worker type are usually the nihilists. This sort of what do you call it? Like an anti-salt of the earth, like people who are so salt of the earth that they've just accepted their curmudgeonly rough existence as all that there is. And then there's often these characters like Tobin in Blood Meridian, these sort of true believers. This split is always there, and I think the question is always up for us to answer who we want to side with. But the key factor here, I think, is death. So the novel does open with a death, and not just any death. It opens with a suicide victim's body being sort of haphazardly dragged out of the river of life that Suttree is living alongside, and then
he's fished
out. And then spoiler, but kind of a non-spoiler alert. Right at the end, we are confronted with the question of whether or not Suttree literally died in his houseboat, or whether or not we want to side with a sort of psychological, metaphorical reading that this other side of Suttree, who is throughout the novel, died, and that who is walking off is the Suttree who's had to give something up. And I think McCarthy at all points in his literature actually offers us both options with a lot of things. He says you can read this literally if you want, and could not too much maybe would change, but you also are often given the option, much like the ending of Blood Meridian. I think that can be split into an empirical reading and a metaphorical reading. But the point being that death is there throughout this whole novel, but it's a death of either acceptance, in which case the people of this sort of shantytown where Suttree is, I think, have accepted their lot in life and are sort of the living dead. Or it's this journey of the ego, like for Suttree, where eventually he can no longer just remain as alienated as he is, and something has to die, has to give, and he has to move away, much like McCarthy did in his own life. I think when he had this sort of transition away from like J-Bone is based on Jim Long, his real life friend, and so, in real life, McCarthy then moves off to Santa Fe and, far distance from his life in Knoxville.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I do think this is maybe one place to talk about how this novel, might represent a development from another one that we talked about, Outer Dark. So, when we discussed Outer Dark, we talked a lot about the question of, even though McCarthy is setting us up or giving us all of these chances to kind of read the novel allegorically or symbolically, right? Like whether it's through biblical symbolism or even just, I remember we discussed light quite a bit. So light is all over the novel, but it's a very bleak, cold light. It's not really, it's not any kind of good light that's showing us the way, so to speak. That's here too, but I also think you're right to point out those passages, right? In those conversations that Suttree has with other characters, they're talking about that, right? Like it's the novel, but it's also their lives, and then it's also us as readers trying to understand like how to make sense of this novel. And I think if death is, I guess, there at every turn throughout the novel, the question then becomes, just as you said, like how is it there, right? I mean, there's the literal, sure, we get the literal death or whatever, but then we have people's responses to it, and in the way that it's written and the way that that Suttree kind of treats it. And I do want to just quickly, I'm looking through my notes here, and I have a really great, it's just a quick quote from Jonathan and Rick Elmore, their article, Life, Unity, and Suffering, the Moral of Cormac McCarthy's Suttree. So they're talking about when his friend Red Callahan dies, right? So he's, I think, shot in the head at a bar after some kind of dispute or whatever. And they write, as evident in his response to Red Callahan's death, Suttree seeks a life whose meaning derives only from itself. Resistance to his father's logic requiring a notion of life whose meaning would not be defined simply in opposition to its contrary. So on the one hand, this also ropes in, I think, maybe something else that we'll talk about, which is this kind of, idea of individualism, or, how, I mean, what it means to be American, I guess, which is also a big thing in this novel, right? So his father is kind of this, just like death, I guess, is kind of like a ghost who haunts him throughout the novel. There are multiple ghosts, I guess, that are maybe haunting Suttree, right? His dead brother, his dead child, his father, death itself. He's kind of always being, so instead of the trio in Outer Dark, he has these kind of metaphorical roving band of things that are kind of always on his mind. But his father, I think, we get these kind of glimpses, like there's a letter that he gets from his father, and his father seems to just be this pretty callous, pretty bought into this kind of idea of the social hierarchy, I guess, and Suttree wants to get away from that. I think that's also why why Suttree is in this bizarre position of being, a college educated white man who's living in, these kind of dangerous slums, and he's, he doesn't fit in, but he's there. Like he's on the inside while also being on the outside. And I think that's maybe his attempt to grapple with how, not only how to understand things, but just how to be when there are these kind of dualistic oppositions that neither one seems to really be adequate.
Yeah, so to continue on from what you're saying in terms of Suttree's self and Suttree as an individual, which is probably the through line that you're following the most, I think, as the reader. There's this, and you mentioned there, Suttree's twin dead brother, his father as well, and you said about his father being this sort of typical sort of, we get the impression he's kind of draconic. And I think at once in the letter, I think his father says something like, meaning in life is where there is responsibility, which is almost laughable in relation to how Suttree is now living. And there's this quote, his fetch come up from life's other side like an autoscopic hallucination. Suttree and anti-Suttree, hand reaching to the hand. And then there's another much later on. In these silent, sunless galleries, he'd come to feel that another went before him, and each glade he entered seemed just quit by a figure who he'd been sitting there and risen and gone on. Some double-goer, some other Suttree eluded him in these woods. And that's from a scene that we'll probably get to when he goes to the wilderness. But this notion that's placed in very early on, and of course in your first read, you're probably not going to make too much of it, but this notion of Suttree and anti-Suttree, this is once again the non-linear facts of the novel that Suttree, anti-Suttree was like, okay, well, what does that mean? Much later on, then we find out about his dead, the haunting of the dead sibling. And I think Suttree and anti-Suttree is between them and in their friction is really why the novel, to be honest, seems to have any momentum altogether. So if we were to say that Suttree was just Suttree, this all sounds very abstract, but if Suttree was just Suttree, there wouldn't really be a novel, because he would have that imminent contentment to just stay in the slums, or if he was whatever the other Suttree who'd followed his father, he wouldn't even be here. He'd be off, I don't know, studying at Harvard or Yale or something. And he's caught in this friction, as you mentioned. He's college educated. He's clearly very smart. He calls his uncle a maudlin sot. So he's got a sort of obscurely incredible language that he uses. He's clearly very well educated. So it's apparent almost immediately that he is an extremely intelligent character who is therefore alienated from this place of the slums, from the salt of the earth setting. And yet at the same time, much like, I know McCarthy liked this film. It's one of the few times McCarthy mentions liking a film. Much like the protagonist of 5 Easy Pieces, he also is aware of his own intelligence and just can't really settle anywhere. And it's in this friction between the two that I think we see Suttree kind of being propelled through the novel, because he makes, decisions as Suttree that might land him in the jail. But equally, that intelligence is there that he probably would look around and not see this as just a determined thing and want to get out of it. So, there's a friction there that I don't think actually gets resolved at the end of the novel, to be honest. I don't see the end of the novel as anything like a redemption, but maybe we'll get to that. But Suttree as an individual, I think, is he's alienated from himself. He's he's kind of he's a contradiction. He shouldn't be where he is, and that is it's unsettling. But that is that unsettling feeling is like that bubble is constantly burst by people like Gene Harrogate. Like, you need the comedy, otherwise this would be like really bleak.
Yeah, he shouldn't be where he is, but not being where he shouldn't be is how he survives at the same time, right? I mean, I think you were alluding to it earlier, but when he finds the corpse on his houseboat, if he was where he was supposed to be, then that would have been his corpse, right? And so, yeah, I do think it's appropriate that he's always kind of being haunted, and I think that this is maybe one place where we see McCarthy, as we were kind of talking about at the beginning, like making a truly 3-dimensional, not just character, but novel. He's no longer haunted by 3 horsemen or 3 roving marauders or whatever. He's haunted by this kind of more like metaphysical or ontological problem. And that problem looks a bunch of different ways, right? So he goes back for his child's, as you said, for the funeral, and then he's kind of chased away. He travels, right? He tries. I mean, it is in a weird way. It feels like he's like trying to find himself, but not in some sense of self-actualization, but actually just trying to find out where he should be, even physically, right? Like, where am I supposed to go to like have this stuff all fall in place around me, and each time, it's not like he's chased from place to place and it's horrible like it is in Outer Dark. It's not like he messes up a job, steals a guy's boots, gets the guy killed, has to end up giving the boots back to the trio, as what happens to Cullen. But he goes to a new place and actually has like a good time, and then something goes wrong, and so on the one hand we could read that as him kind of having to pay for his pleasure, which I think there's plenty of that throughout the novel. But I also think it's more complicated than that. I think there's a recognition on McCarthy's part that it's if these things are dualistic, they're still intertwined. There's still the death that's whatever haunting Suttree is kind of the other side of the life that he's there living, even if he's not in the right place. Yeah, I wonder.
Well, this brings me to a thread which I was trying to think about how I'd describe it this morning, and pretentiously I would say it's romantically anti-romantic. So when I read this novel, I actually suddenly realized, like, I hadn't really thought of it in these terms, but it is extremely romantic with regards to the physicality, with regards to the setting, with regards to this lifestyle, with regard, like the quote I wanted to read, and it's a great example of the humor, is this one, which I think will hopefully get across what I mean. This is when Gene Harrogate, who is this sort of figure of innocence, finds his home. So The viaduct spanned a jungly gut filled with wreckage and a few packing crate shacks inhabited by transient blacks, and down through this puling waste, the dark and leprous waters of First Creek threaded the sumac and poison ivy. High water marks of oil and sewage and condoms dangling in the branches like stranded leeches. Harrogate made his way through this derelict fairyland toward the final concrete arches of the viaduct, where they ran to earth. He entered delicately, his eyes skittering about. There was no one in. The earth was cool and naked and dry. Here's some bones, broken glass, a few stray dog turds, 2 bent and mangled parking meters with clots of concrete about their roots. Boy, whispered Harrogate. So, in reality, Dean Harrogate, this bumbling buffoon who's just got out of prison, has... I mean, in reality, right, this is probably McCarthy's brilliance here, this is a moron who has just stumbled across a basically under an underpass filled with dog shit, and there's something about it that for Harrogate is like, oh, like he's saying, because as this section goes on, you realize like he's like, whoa, this is great, like boy. And I think later on he says to Suttree like, oh yeah, I found a nice place, and he's like frying up pigeons on a grill he's made there.
Yeah.
So there's a romance, like there's a strange beauty for the world, but it's the world unto itself. So when nature is described, when the river is described, even when it's full of condoms and shit and death, there is a beauty unto itself of nature in this world. And the humans are put up against, and the human beings, the characters are put up against that. And, someone like Harrogate, who almost gets himself killed many times because of this, it's because of his innocence in the face of it. But there is a romance for the lifestyle, for the kind of world that they're inhabiting. But we get to see the romance and read about it sort of pleasantly. But the romance portrays them in an anti-romantic way. So it's like you get these scenes of like the dodgy bar or the horrible hooch that they're drinking. And it's like you don't just get that because you also get this like hangover scene a few times. And the hangovers the hangovers are written in a way of like, I really want to skip this because this is too real. This is horribly... McCarthy, like the bit I feel he gets so right is when he says something like pushing his head against the window just to feel the coolness, which is something I've literally done multiple times with The Hangover. It's just like, so it's like, yeah, here's your romance, but if you engage in that, it's not really for human beings. Like, this is a rough life.
Yeah, and yet, I mean, Gene has a home, right? He has a place. Just like Suttree, right? Gene can go home. He maybe what he's after is freedom. I mean, this he does feel like a very immature character in that sense, right? Where like, I could imagine if I'm thinking back to when I was like a teenager or whatever, I probably, even if it was the worst apartment in the world, if I could get my own apartment, I probably would have been psyched about it, right? Right. So I wonder if, I think that's maybe part of it, but you're right. This kind of the beauty of that freedom that, that's out there is, freedom isn't a positive value, right? It's totally neutral in this world, right? So sure, Gene has his own space, but as you said, it's under an underpass. He's not safe from like I think dogs or whatever come and try to get his food. He gets all this food, or what is it? Is it a pig he kills or something like that? He has to like work it off. There's all this. He's always kind of bumbling into these. He accidentally wrongs somebody because he's so stupid that he doesn't think that like a hog doesn't belong to someone, and so then he, there's all this stuff that goes wrong, and then he does get the meat, but then the meat gets taken by dogs, and so in a way, it is not dissimilar to what happens in Outer Dark, but there is this humor to it, right? Like there is this kind of like, and there's maybe, instead of thinking back on reading the novel, maybe part of the way that beauty comes through is through the humor. So even when there is something that's like just really awful, happening to, I think especially Gene, when there's something really awful happening to him, and the way that it's written is just so, it's funny, but it's not really over the top, even though describing it sounds really over the top. Like, this guy going around fucking watermelons, and then, he detonates like whatever in the sewer, and then he gets covered in shit, and then but then there's the moment when Suttree finds him and he's all like caked with shit and like red clay and everything, and I think Suttree's pointing a light at him and he says, "You mind getting that light out of my face?" There's this and then he says, "I would give $10 cash money for a glass of water," or something like that. Like there's this ridiculous humor, but it's not I don't know, something about it feels natural, and I think maybe the idea of nature in a larger sense is something that we should talk about too.
Well, one thing just on the lifestyle, because a lot of the, let's say, the action you mentioned before we started recording, this connection to the beats, the connection to that the beat type freedom, and On the Road by Kerouac is like, of the well-known novels, it's probably my least favorite novel. I don't really get much from it. It's a fetishization that I don't really like. So I think Suttree, the book, is an antidote to this. And I want to actually just go back to Gene Harrogate, because it's probably is, for me, the funniest, the most absurd, and yet one of the most sort of telling scenes. So in the novel, in Suttree, there is this plot point that there are bats with, they've got this infectious disease. And so, to stop the spread of this infectious disease, if you bring a dead bat to this, I think it's like a veterinary or a clinic or a hospital, they'll pay you, I think it's quite a bit for the era. I think it's like 50 cents maybe, or 20 cents. Quite a lot. And to like basically to take this corpse out, I guess, out of nature to stop the spread of the disease. And Gene Harrogate, in a sort of strange twist on American individualism and entrepreneurial spirit, because it's almost like this is oddly genius, like something out of Ed, Edd n Eddy, fastens 3 car hoods together into a makeshift boat. I think they're car hoods. And this sculpture is actually in Knoxville. They've made a sculpture of this. And he rows down a river with a catapult, shooting live bats out of the sky. And the image that makes me laugh is he goes to the place where they're paying for these dead bats to stop the spread of disease, with like 2 sacks of bats, which is ridiculous. And this doctor, who's clearly quite draconic, sort of like, "What have you done? Like, we could have you arrested." And I think they sort of in pity give him $2, because they're just like, this guy's clearly just an idiot. But this in itself plays on one of the themes, which is this sort of Americana entrepreneurial freedom that comes from sort of a strange libertarianism if you're an outcast. And so all these people are always trying to just find enough money. A lot of Suttree, the actual character, a lot of the action for him early on is seeing what he has to go through just to get like $1, which is selling catfish. That, like, his whole day at one point is spent catching the catfish, taking them to 2 different shops and getting, I guess, just his money for the day. And so, at the background against someone like Suttree's father, against the eventual knowledge that the whole shantytown is being destroyed for an urban development, are a bunch of outcasts who are caught up in the same dream, but trying to find their own weird way to visualize that freedom. And I think Harrogate's own bat-killing scene is like the entrepreneurial spirit of this shantytown. And it shows that, I guess, the difference between that which they're outcasted from. Like, they just can't quite do it. But I just love that scene so much.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, he's shooting, he has like a slingshot and he's catapulting poison, right? He's like, and they eat the poison, then they just drop dead. Which is also maybe like a nicely symbolic line about what Gene it's almost like the world is a trap for Gene, and he can't help but gobble up whatever's there, and then he doesn't drop dead, but he gets a slap on the wrist or whatever. I mean, I also just to ramble a little bit on Gene's character too, I love the scene where the part of the novel where he figures out this telephone scam. It's like a payphone. I forget what it is. He ends up like busting open the payphones or getting all this money or something, and then there's this description of him. He has like fancy clothes on. He kind of dressed like some kind of hustler or whatever. He has like he's kind of walking around town, and obviously he's going to get caught, because he's so flashy about his money and everything. Um, but I think you're right. I mean, I think that uh, if this is some kind of, I mean, if it is a kind of epic, some kind of epic novel or something, or we can at least think about it in those terms, then I mean, Suttree most of all, but I think also everybody is just trying to figure out what their, whatever their niche is, and so all the characters, it is kind of funny because a lot of the characters are just kind of always doing the same thing, right? And that also feels like very much like an epic or like mythological thing to me. They're always just, oh, Gene's always doing some harebrained scheme, these guys are always like, drinking at the Jones's place, and Ab Jones himself is always, there's that amazing scene where he gets into that altercation with the police, and then Suttree drives the cop car into the river, which is like, again, this is one of those scenes that was a page turning scene because it's so intense. And then you also have Suttree who's like doing this, ultimately small act of rebellion, but that's a moment where Suttree actually like, takes an action, which I think is maybe another important thing to consider. It's like what's motivating what he does at any given point in the novel. I mean, obviously that moment is partly friendship, partly this kind of revolt against these police, but also partly, I guess, a larger revolt, right? Like about meaning, or about how he's supposed to, where he's supposed to be, or what he's supposed to be doing, and yeah.
Yeah, well, I think if Suttree's own quest is for anything, it's he's a typical too smart for his own good, especially in the situation that he's within. And so I don't think it's necessarily banal to say that a lot of McCarthy's work centers around people who are searching for meaning. There is an existentialism there, and Suttree is searching for meaning. But I think the difference with McCarthy's worlds is that you are given worlds where the key factors for meaning. So he could have been his father's protege and taken responsibility and probably become especially in the, where's this set? This is set in the 50s. He could have likely become some sort of careerist, something or other in this sort of possible boom time. So that's there. But one thing I think that deflates this quest of meaning is that he's in, and I think this is great against the beats, and this is where the anti-romanticism comes in, is that he's engaged in a lifestyle which is sort of fetishistically adored by those who are searching for meaning. Like, what if you were down and out, really down there in the trenches of drug addicts and prostitutes and people and jail, right? And the novel throws everything at you that could begin to form a sense of self-meaning, like typical jail time, or I lived as a down and out, or whatever it might be. And yet Suttree, with this form of alienation that he has because of his intelligence and because of who he is, he never really, when he's in jail, he's just sat reading the paper most of the time. And when he's in the flats, when he's in I think it is McAnally Flats is what it's based around. He's usually wandering between people and people. And if he goes for a drink, he has one, and then he's like, "Oh, I've got to go see someone else." And he's drifting. He can't really fully engage with meaning. And I think maybe a lot of this has to do with the hauntings that we've already mentioned. But there is this sense that you're given a world, again, much like Outer Dark, where maybe the possibility of meaning has already been destroyed. Is it a nihilistic world? Is the world itself nihilistic? And Suttree is a bit too smart for it. That's, I don't know. I mean, many people have commented that it's there's one. This is a quote from Stairwell to Nowhere, one of the essays you sent me. For Metris, the darkness and nothingness of McCarthy's novel is not a sign that the divine is simply absent, only that the mystery of God is finally incomprehensible to us. And this is the difficulty of McCarthy's worlds. Is like, all right, what happens in a world where, the Nietzschean death of God has been accepted once again?
Yeah, I mean, I think partly too, it's Suttree is rebelling, or he's so whatever. It doesn't really look at times like a search for meaning, right? He's maybe it's a non-search for meaning, but I think partly what he's responding to is the people who think they understand, whether it's meaning in general or God or whatever, right? Because there's at one point he's at a baptism, right? He goes like a christening in the river, and I think he ends up he's like drinking with two old men on the riverbank or something like that. There's that kind of crazed, I think also blind, just like, we have so many, you're right, blind men are always in McCarthy's work, but there's that kind of crazed person who's up in the window, who's always shouting out the window, these kind of apocalyptic, hellfire sermons at whoever walks by, right? And certainly Suttree gets his fair share of that. But even that person, I think later in the novel, Suttree realizes he's like walking across the street and he's expecting to hear this kind of crazed person shouting at him. And I think I can't remember exactly where this is in the novel, but I know it's closer to the end. He said something about how he was surprised because he already got halfway across the street before the shouting started, right? So even that person is losing steam with how vitriolic they are, right? Which is, funny, but also maybe betrays something about this kind of, even those who do think they know what kind of, what God is, what meaning is, what life means. They're still within all of that. Like they're still within life. And I think that quote you read makes a lot of sense there, right? Like if there is a God in this world, then it's unknowable, right? And there's going to be, you still have to navigate from within. So I think this ties back too to what you said about this kind of lifestyle. So yeah, Suttree's in jail, but he still has to like live and have a daily life in jail, right? So he's not going to be, you can't be brawling all the time, right? I mean, some people I guess can, right? And there are those characters. There are characters who are just kind of in and out of jail constantly, right? But Suttree in a way feels much more measured, right? Like he's not, he does drink a lot, but he's not one of the characters who is always asking for a drink, right? Like there's a scale within the novel of what people are doing. Like, yeah, sure, he's a criminal, but he's not robbing, we find out that he did go to jail for being part of like was it a drugstore holdup or something? And he was drunk in the car and fell asleep or something. He was supposed to be the getaway driver, lookout or something. So even his engagement in crime is kind of passive, right? He's not this kind of criminal mastermind. And so he does, how this positions him relative to knowledge and how he moves around in the world is I do think, yeah, it has to do with his intelligence, but it also has to do with this position of understanding that he can't be fully outside. So even though he's on the outside while being in the inside, he's not outside in the sense of, oh, well, now I understand how this world works because I can view it from this position. And maybe at the same time, this is why he chooses to be in this like destitute place, right? Because maybe being the career, tycoon or, college guy or whatever feels false the same way that being a crazy preacher to him also feels false.
Yeah, he's sort of in this strange, fun, beat-esque hell that, like a little bit like it feels a bit like a carnival, but he's there with a conscience that, though isn't necessarily made explicit, it's clear that Suttree is both smart enough and also has this life experiences with not just sort of a violent barbarian death, which might be able to be pushed away as part of that lifestyle, but these more harrowing forms of death that really haunt him. And so he clearly has a conscience. And I think this is why he takes Harrogate, because this is one of the facets of the novel that I find fascinating, is why does Suttree sympathize with Harrogate and basically take him under his wing and actually have patience for him, right? Because Harrogate does turn up again to find Suttree. And I think it's because, and it's one of the reasons Gene Harrogate I think is so lovable, is that he comes across as a figure of pure innocence that is just either he's completely lost and is sort of just in awe of this silly underground place that he's found as his home, or his actions are mimicry of those that he sees as authority figures. And so Gene Harrogate is sort of without a conscience, but not in the sense that he's evil, but in the sense that he's pure innocence let loose. He's like a remnant of an old world that's been let loose in a world in transition, which is, this world of Suttree is emphatically in transition. And I think what we're seeing is characters who are caught, who have one foot in the old world. Because some of these characters feel like, they could have been cowboys, but it's like, yeah, that world's gone. You can't really sit around the bar all day and then shoot someone in the head, or do you have a brawl and get away with it? So they've sort of built this halfway house between cowboy, the West, and the New World. And yeah, Gene Harrogate's maybe like the last innocent trooper of that world let loose, but he's also an idiot.
Yeah, he's never taken a shower, right? When he goes to jail.
He doesn't even know what a shower is.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I know you wanted to, so, we've spoken about the self of Suttree, the character. And so at one point he loses himself. And well, for a couple of points really, but I know you wanted to mention this time where Suttree just, he heads off into the mountains, right?
Yeah. So I wonder, I mean, I do have another novel I want to pull into this a little bit. And this is maybe like a more, partly a view of something I think that, McCarthy is maybe echoing here, because I don't know if it's really been remarked upon before, but yeah, I mean, maybe we can start with the Suttree and then kind of get there and then come back. So yeah, he kind of, I mean, so the places in the novel where he leaves, right? This happens a couple of times, right? So he leaves, he goes in, I think it's earlier in the first half of the novel, right? When he leaves, he goes kind of on the river and he takes up with his family. He ends up, I forget the guy's name, but he's kind of like he's trying to sell pearls, right? He gets the oysters and he's, finding the pearls, and then they go into town, try to sell the pearls. And Suttree's kind of like, damn it, this is bullshit. Like, these aren't real pearls. Like, this isn't worth anything, whatever. And then he somehow makes a deal. They, of course, blow all the money on, a night of drinking and prostitution. But then he, ends up getting involved with this family, the oldest daughter in the family, who's then killed, right? Like, there's this moment where these two kind of twin brothers, right, show up, and right after they show up that night, it starts raining out. There's like a rock slide or a landslide, and she's crushed to death, and then Suttree just leaves, right? So that trip that he takes, he goes back, back to where he spends most of the novel. Then he leaves again, and this time he just kind of wanders out into the woods. And it's like, there is clearly some biblical overtones here, because it's like 40 days and 40 nights he's in the woods, right? He's also, it seems the implication is that he's hallucinating because of alcohol withdrawal, right? So he's just alone in the woods and he starts hallucinating. But he runs into, I think there's a hunter, like a poacher, who kind of threatens him. He ends up going into this diner. He gets chased out because he insults them because he can't eat the food. So again, it's a very kind of wandering part of the novel. But what I find interesting is just he goes into the mountains and he just has no, like, maybe in a less kind of banal way, he's maybe trying to commune with nature or something like that, right? Like, he goes into the woods and I don't know. What do you think he's trying to do here? Because I still kind of wonder about this.
Well, it's a sort of,
I'll also say this is right after he visits the witch, right? So he and Ab Jones go visit the witch, and actually what ends up happening is Ab Jones, he goes with him to talk to the witch, but she ends up saying something about Suttree, not about Jones, right? She says, "You should have come alone," and then he realizes that he realizes that she was talking to him, Suttree, not Jones, and so she sees this kind of like evil or something, or some destiny of him, and this is like right before. It's like the page before he goes to into the woods.
I think for me, this scene was like reminiscent. Actually, sure, it's biblical, and of course, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which I've been reading recently, is also biblically inspired. But this for me was more akin to that. But what I saw here, probably just is on my mind lately. But Suttree is he's fragmented in any. In any, and the whole book, actually, let's say the whole book, and I don't want to apply binary dualisms in a very straightforward sense, so take this with a pinch of salt, but, Suttree versus the down and out outcast Suttree versus his father's expectations, the industrialization of Knoxville, the urban development being built versus the sort of natural shantytown of the shantytown. Suttree being alive and anti-Suttree, which is the haunt of his dead sibling, also being a binary. And so Suttree is constantly engaged with, I think, a quest for wholeness that the world will never afford him. And when he goes to the mountains, it's sort of the stereotypical form of exit to find, like, literally find oneself. I mean, he's gone traveling, but he's of course taken himself with him. And there is a few moments there when he does this escape that he sort of seems to become one with nature, very momentarily. And the way nature here is described, one of them is he looked at a world of incredible loveliness. And loveliness, I mean, come on, it's Cormac McCarthy and he's using the word loveliness. That's a bit tongue in cheek. So I think McCarthy's having this little bit of a joke of, he gets this sort of dissension of the self, this dissipation of the self into nature, extremely momentarily. But is it just because of alcohol withdrawal? Is this sort of strange mysticism that appears because of alcohol withdrawal or illness? And, but once again, much like the ending of the novel, well, what comes of it? Is this the anti-romanticism once again? And McCarthy saying, yeah, he lost his self in the woods and then he went back to a diner, right? Like, and then he's back in town. Like, it's kind of a lame 40 days, 40 nights. If after that you're still stuck in the same pit.
First of all, I like that you pointed out the loveliness line. I whenever I come across something like that, I've started really paying attention because I think maybe, this is my little theory here. I think when you have an incredibly poetic text that drops in just kind of like crappy lines like that, it is, I mean, maybe it's tongue in cheek, but maybe it's also saying that we don't need poetry anymore for this moment, right? Like it's there, there are other things that I read where he felt perfectly happy, right? It's like a very complex, dense, thing. And maybe it is to partly remind us that these things that we think are cliche are real, if we just try to avoid stating them in so bare terms. So maybe that loveliness or that whatever is a gesture toward being, not really being able to do justice to whatever. But I wonder, can I read a little bit in this section? So I'll try to cover a couple pages here quickly because I think it's worth like looking at some of his descriptions because I do think this is McCarthy's worlds are so bleak, but there is still like a beautiful natural world, even though we're usually seeing the gray, burnt, abandoned cars that were once on fire and are now just charred, whatever. There's still the really beautiful stuff. So this is, I'm on page 283 of my edition here. This is just this, I'll read a little bit of this. So in late October, he pulled his lines. Leaves were falling in the river, and the days of windy rain and wood smoke took him back to other times more than he would have liked. He made himself up a pack from old sacking and rolled his blanket, and with some rice and dried fruit and a fish line, he took a bus to Gatlinburg. He hiked up into the mountains. The season had gone before, some trees gone barren, none still green. He spent the night on a ledge above the river, and all night he could hear the ghosts of lumber trains, a liquid clicking and long shunt and clatter, and the jargon of old rusted trucks on rails long gone. The first few dawns half made him nauseous. He'd not seen one dead sober for so long. He sat in the cold gray light and watched, mummied up in his blanket. A small wind blew. A rack of clouds troweled across the east, grew mauve and yellow, and the sun came boring up. He was moved by the utter silence of it. He turned his back to the warmth. Yellow leaves were falling all through the forest, and the river was filled with them, shuttling and winking, golden leaves that rushed like poured coins in the tailwater, a perishable currency forever renewed. In an old grandfather time, a ballad transpired here, some love gone wrong, and a sable-tressed girl drowned in an ice-green pool where she was found with her hair spreading like ink on the cold and cobbled river floor, ebbing in her bindings, languorous as a sea dream, looking up with eyes made huge by the water, at the bellies of trout and the well of the rimpled world beyond. Suttree lay on a warm rock above the river and watched the trout drift and quarter over the cold gray stones. He had baited his small hook with rice grains. The trout stood or sidled or turned among the pouring leaves. Bull trout with rut-warped snouts, pale trout with velvet fins. They would not bite. So he goes into the woods. He is like admiring the beautiful natural world, but then he starts trying to do what he normally does to survive, which is to fish, and the fish won't bite. So there's some kind of like ambivalence or, uncertainty around the nature here. But then he sees a snake, right? Like he is picking up stones to find worms? Yeah. In the morning, turning up the frost-veined stones for bait, he uncovered a snake. Soporific, sleek viper with flanged jaw hinges. Fate-ridden snake, of all stones in the forest, this one to sleep beneath. Suttree could not tell if it watched him or not. Little brother Death with his quartz goat's eyes. He lowered the stone with care. So there's, again, a snake, like he's in the Garden of Eden or whatever, right? And there's also this mention of little brother Death. And I think this scene does pretty quickly devolve after this into like these weird hallucinatory visions. I mean, this is where he's talking about, and I think you maybe mentioned this line earlier, but this idea that there's always one coming before him, right? And so like he's always being not haunted in the way that we usually think or followed, but he's following after somebody. And so in that sense, he's haunted, right? Like there's another Suttree who's, in the clearing before he gets there, but has left before, right? So there's this, I think maybe you're right, like this kind of non-coincidence of the self, or this idea that he's kind of fragmented or he's losing his self. But I don't know. What do you think of like this snake? I mean, I'm kind of puzzled a little bit over.
I think once again, I mean, that's a symbolic nod to you don't get to have that, right? Like in this this attempt to do, like Suttree is smart enough to know that this attempt is wholly romantic and there really is no such thing. What's gone is gone. And I mean, Suttree has consistently throughout his life fallen into this belief that he can just get away from the past. And, ultimately in him doing that and not just I guess productively dealing with it, but just trying to get away, it seems to come back and bite him even harder, right? To get away from the death of his child, to get away from his father. I mean, this has all resulted in him kind of just running away from himself. And I don't want to reduce this novel to dude needs to just deal with some problems in a very basic way. But you can go off into the idyllic woods, but I mean, I think it's kind of maybe a very simple symbol, right? You can go off there, but what do you think was going to happen? You think there wasn't going to be any snakes? You had your little moment you had your idyllic moment, and this snake's still there for you.
Yeah, I mean, there's also, and this is maybe opens onto a larger question that we can maybe talk about, but not only can he not get rid of his past, right, but even like this kind of mythical past comes back during this scene too, right? So the first, he looks at the water, and then there's just this brief, strange description of like a legend of a girl drowning in the lake. And then on the next page, I think it's the next page, when they were building the highway through the mountains, a horseman came this way along the river, the gravel peppering the water. But basically, it's a description of a horseman who went under a bridge or something and just got like gouged in the head, and his dead body was hanging there, and the horse kept going. Which we don't. I mean, how does Suttree know this? Who's, and there's been some great stuff in the scholarship about who the narrator is here, right? Like who's actually telling this, because there are moments where it has to be Suttree, but then there are moments where it can't be Suttree. And I think maybe this point in the novel is like a nice distillation of that, right? Like if he is this kind of fragmented self, if also, as I think you suggested in Outer Dark, the main character is the world, I do think that there's something going on here too about that. Like this, we're in such a fragmented perspective where not only are the characters concerned with how to make meaning in the world, but also the world itself, refuses to really tell them how, and in that way is really participating in their struggle. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I think this part is interesting because it's very short, and yet, you know, as you said here, he's just kind of in the woods. He's kind of going crazy. It seems like not even just hallucinating, but just seeming to be really out of it. It says everything had fallen from him. He scarce could tell where his being ended or the world began, nor did he care. He lay on his back in the gravel, the earth's core sucking his bones, a moment's giddy vertigo with this illusion of falling outward through the blue and windy space over the offside of the planet, hurtling through the high, thin cirrus. So he just has this feeling that he's like falling off of the earth while he's totally immersed in nature. And again, alone, which is, it's one of the only times that he's, I think, physically alone in the novel.
It makes me want to ask them, where in the novel is Suttree comfortable? He seems very comfortable when he's in prison, but I think maybe that's just because he understands that, well, I can't leave, so well. But in prison, he's mostly like just sat on his bed reading a paper, and he's pretty chill. But I guess he can't leave. But where else, where one might say that Suttree truly feels like at home? I'm not sure anywhere fully stands out.
That's a really good point, because even he's at least restless most of the time, right? If not uncomfortable, he's at least restless. Like, he's, as you said, he always has these appointments to go, drink at the bar or go, but he's checking in on friends too, right? Like, he has this kind of, his day is divided up into these little, I have to go see this person. I have to go see this person. And again, it's worth pointing out too that a lot of these people are just like the drag. We can call them the dregs of society. Yeah.
Well, that's what McCarthy's going for. But this is pointed out really early on in the novel, where the famous "Get You a Tater" scene, where in the shantytown there's this random old man who's cooking jacket potatoes, what we call jacket potatoes here in England, on a hubcap, and he's just sort of, I think he's just asking the old man about how his day's been like, and he just keeps telling him to get a tater. And I remember reading that for the first time, because he says, "Oh no, I've got to be getting on." Just having this feeling of like, where does Suttree have to be? Like, what's he? And I wonder if that busyness is just what keeps him. Because even in bars, when people are drinking, he doesn't always stick around for the whole thing. He'll come for a drink and then leave.
Yeah.
So yeah, it makes me want. I don't think he's really at home. I don't think he's really. Maybe the notion of a home is a bit cheap, but he's. I wonder if, because of what we know about his past, that contentment is kind of an impossibility for him.
Yeah, and that seems partly hereditary. I mean, it's not only the disagreement with his father, but it's the fact that his mother. I mean, part of the the father's, and this comes out in the conversation with his uncle, who just kind of inexplicably comes to visit him near the beginning of the novel. Right, his father has this disdain for him because, I think, as Suttree said, like, if a man marries lower or marries beneath him, then he resents his children, essentially, or whatever. Right. And so maybe Suttree has taken that to heart. And yet I don't think that he's clearly not a totally nihilistic character, right? I mean, he does seem to be questioning all of this, but he does, as we kind of said already, he does take a bunch of actions within the novel. Right?
I think maybe he wants to be, maybe he kind of desires to be nihilist, kind of desires to be able to throw it all over to hedonism, and yet, like going back for the funeral is a bit like, why is he doing this? Almost like he's being pulled, and then that moment, which is a moment of pure harrowing meaning for him, kind of destroys him for a short amount of time, and so he wants to be a nihilist, but then there's just these moments of like, this means something whether you like it or not. You're like, you can't escape the meaning that is haunting you from I guess from the unconscious, whether it's the father, whether it's the dead child, whether it's love. These things will haunt you, and the more you push away, the more they destroy you.
Yeah, I mean, he's really he's a very sensitive character. So he's not only very intelligent, and yeah, I mean the way that, and this is why maybe the idea of who, or the question of who's narrating this book is an interesting one, because we have these words that just you would never hear, even I've never heard before, right? That seem to be part of Suttree's vocabulary for whatever reason, right?
Oh
And
yeah, I
sometimes,
mean, if we haven't made it clear, like in terms of pulling out quotes to read, I mean, you could open the book at any page. Like this is a masterwork of prose, and just the opening 2 pages actually is basically McCarthy being like, "Oh, you want to see how well I can? Do you want to see how well I can write?"
yeah. And yeah, and also my stumbling over my words when I was just reading a few minutes ago is like, because the way the sentences are constructed are so bizarre, right? Like there are barely ever any commas. They're all kind of run-on sentences with a bunch of ands. Nouns are used as verbs and vice versa, right? I mean, it's the rhythm of the prose is really
Yeah.
really strange.
So let's address the ending. So
Yeah.
the ending is that he's sicker than sick, iller, seemingly empirically iller than a man can have any sort of ability to be. He's back on his houseboat, and then we're given this imagery of, I mean, it's clearly, deliberately, highly ambiguous. The language at points is precise in its ambiguity, like this notion, McCarthy making it clear, like there was I think a body laid there. So we're given this notion that maybe Suttree died, and that whether or not these people who are coming in to take him away, whether or not they're like the ambulance and the coroner who've come to take away a dead body, or this figure that is leaving the houseboat and looking back is Suttree, metaphorically looking back at part of his self that has died. I think if one wishes to argue either way, like a lot of McCarthy's work, it can be done. But for me, the importance of the novel is this another escape? Is he just leaving? Like has he changed? Because what happens during this period of sort of seeming catharsis and possible redemption, where he finally sort of repents in this nightmarish ill state, the irony for me is that McCarthy makes it clear that it's happening while he's ill. And so I wonder, to what extent has Suttree changed? Is he just leaving again?
Yeah, it's a good, I don't know, it's a good question. I mean, I think there is like certainly a symbolic thing. So yeah, he goes back to the houseboat. He says he found the houseboat door ajar and someone sleeping in his bed, and then turns out to be a corpse, right? And then basically right after that too, Harrogate's sister just comes looking for him, and apparently he's in jail, right? So Jean, this whatever, Suttree, double anti-Suttree, whatever we want to call it, death has come for Suttree, but Suttree was somewhere else, and that's maybe how he survives. So there's this corpse there, and then also Jean is in jail, as we kind of figured he would somehow wind back up there again. And then yeah, there were very few pages in the novel after that, right? Like he leaves, and the last people he goes to see is, I think, yeah, he goes kind of to like I don't know if it's the drugstore, and he goes and sees like a few like minor characters, right? There's no kind of, leave taking that he does, right? He goes and says bye to a few people, and then he just kind of leaves, right? And then this is where we get the image of the workers kind of drilling, right? There's this kind of industrial process happening. And then a truly amazing poetic ending too, right? Somewhere in the grey wood by the river is the huntsman, and in the brooming corn and in the castellated press of cities. His work lies all wares, and his hounds tire not. I have seen them in a dream, slaverous and wild, and their eyes crazed with ravening for souls in this world. Fly them. So it's also, ends in the second person too, right? Like fly them, like that means like you should, or you might. It's like a directive or whatever. But does Suttree change? I mean, I think I would have to say, or have a similar response to what happens with Culla. Even though these are two very different novels, I think it's really difficult to tell. especially given that we don't really get, we don't get any kind of conclusion, right? We just have this moment of leaving.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I'm just a pessimist. Probably. I don't know. I think I struggle because I so viscerally, and maybe you do as well, I so viscerally know the kind of bars that this shantytown is representative of in real life. And even now, if I drove back through those towns and like look out my car window at who stood outside, it's the same people from 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So and of course Suttree's in that bind, but there's something very real about these kind of people and that's maybe where some of the sort of defeatist pessimism comes in, is that, and that's sometimes comedically turned, like with the initial Gene Harrogate trying to get away from jail early on in the novel, and Suttree saying like, Gene, that they'll drag you back with what's it called, a picket round your ankle, and it's a very quick comment, and then as Suttree is being let out because he's done his time, we literally see Gene Harrogate being dragged by the policeman with the thing around his ankle back into jail, and they sort of just share a look, which I think is a key little scene of the novel of like, I don't know, is this going to change? What's going to change here?
Yeah.
Yeah, and Suttree, of course, is outside of that because he's got this. Yeah, but yeah.
So I mean, I do think it's worth pointing out too that whatever, I mean, we've already touched on this, right? Like some of the other characters are just kind of always doing the same thing. To a certain extent, Suttree is doing the same things a lot of the time, right? Like we'll find him visiting the old man, doing this, but in a way that sameness is, I think, as you said, like the thing that's kind of keeping him going, right? Like, so it's not like he's just sitting around doing one thing all day. He has, a million little appointments. He's a friend to a bunch of people. Like he's always kind of mixing with different people. And so there is obviously like a social aspect to that, but there's also maybe a kind of recognition that, it would be easy for him to kind of just do the same thing and just kind of stay in the same place. And it seems that he's content with that sometimes, but I also think like his restlessness or his inability to really be comfortable shows that he doesn't want to be content with that, maybe. And, and we see this too, like even something as simple as these scenes of drunkenness, right? Like there are these moments where like he refuses alcohol a bunch of times throughout the novel, and he gives his last beer to some guy who showed up or whatever, right? Yeah. And so he does seem to be in that way too, a pretty like, as much trouble as he gets into and is pretty bizarre as some of his journeys are, he does seem to be a kind of like measured character, or at least a character that's concerned with measure and certainly doesn't want to, turn up back in jail with extra shackles or whatever because he tried to escape or, committed a crime so heinous that he gets back in there. But as to like what meaning, or what the character of Suttree means or what he's trying to do, I'm not really sure. I mean, I think McCarthy is asking similar questions about meaning with this one as he did in Outer Dark, but I think that I do feel like this is certainly a more positive novel than Outer Dark. Not that it's a totally optimistic novel, but
it's really fun. I mean, that's the main thing, is just how fun and comedic it is. It's seriously funny, which is writing humor that actually makes you makes the reader genuinely laugh, not just sort of blow air out their nose. That's so difficult. Mm-hmm. William Gaddis does it. There's no one else would spring to mind. Thomas Bernhard, but yeah, there's not many for me that manage to do it.
Yeah, well, because it's not through jokes too, right? It's through the. And I'll touch on this one more time. I know we've talked about this. We talked about this in other conversations, but I don't generally picture stuff when I'm reading, but McCarthy, I think, really forces me to at certain moments, especially with the funny some of the humorous parts, and I guess some of the really tragic or disturbing parts too. But especially those funny parts, you can see Gene Harrogate wearing his fancy clothes that he just bought with his his telephone scam, basically before he gets caught and goes to jail, right? Like he, and that actually, I think that scene too, right? He this is maybe an interesting moment where he's a kind of weird, not double of Suttree, but he's almost like in a way, he's an anti-Suttree, not the one we've been referring to, but I think like a policeman comes and puts his hand on his shoulder, and he comes up behind him and kind of I think that's what leads to him going back into jail. And so instead of, he's not haunted by death at all, really. He's haunted by this kind of inability to make sense of the world, and in a really funny way that just gets him into trouble constantly, right?
Is there anything you want to add about Suttree?
I mean, I would, yeah, I guess I won't go through it totally, but I do want to just make the connection. So I mentioned before we started talking that, and I don't know, someone else could probably say more about it, but I read somewhere that one of McCarthy's favorite novelists was Balzac, who famously wrote, hundreds of novels and stories that are all kind of connected together in this large project to sort of, I don't know, to do a lot of things, I guess. One of the things that he does that I think is probably something we can see with McCarthy's writing is showing these different, I guess you could say, like, through a philosophical novel, playing out certain ideas and showing different aspects of society. And so that's something that Balzac did. It's something that I definitely think McCarthy does. But there is, there's a moment in his novel, it's translated as The Wild Ass's Skin, which is a really bizarre novel that basically, it starts in a really odd way. It revolves around this main character, Raphael, who at the beginning of the novel, he's like about to kill himself. And so he goes into a gambling hall. He places his bet on a roulette thing, and, the outcome is going to decide whether he jumps in the river or not. Right. So he loses, he leaves the gambling hall. I definitely think there's some parallel. I mean, I think McCarthy is definitely interested in chance too. So this is maybe a whole other conversation, but I think that the arbitrariness of a lot of the plotting, this real struggle between, meaninglessness and meaning, or like randomness and, in God, for instance, that we see in Suttree and in other novels is certainly relevant here too. But anyway, what ends up happening is he's kind of wandering around. He's about to go kill himself, but he sees this curio shop. So he goes in and he ends up purchasing this the titular wild ass's skin, which is basically some kind of animal hide that has the magical kind of property of granting him wishes. So anything he wishes for, he has this skin, and his wishes will come true, but the skin will shrink each time. And so the novel it's very bizarre. It kind of goes back and forth between time. But there's a moment near the end of the novel where he's just won a duel. But he wins the duel because he wishes to win the duel, right? So to survive this duel after, he's basically insulted, challenges someone. The guy is apparently an expert shooter, and this character Raphael says, "Look, please apologize to me, and we'll put it off. We don't have to have this duel. Just know that you're going to die if if we do this duel." And the guy's like, "No." So he wins the duel. He shoots the other guy through the heart, and his skin is now, this magical hide is now like that big, right? So it's really shrunken. And so he retreats precisely into the woods to try to not wish for anything and basically not will anything anymore. So there's this whole section in the novel where he's kind of, after he wins this duel, he's, frightened, he's panicking. So he goes very much like what happens in Suttree. He just kind of goes into the woods and tries to, it specifically says he tries to basically be one with nature. And there it's explicitly a gambit to like save his own life, like to not will anymore, so that he doesn't just, it's almost like a picture of Dorian Gray type situation where he just becomes older and old, his life forces are running out. And so I don't know, I think that it's maybe a bit to get into, so I won't get into it now. But there's certainly something there that I think that McCarthy was maybe echoing that, because this would have been, if Balzac was one of his favorite novels, he definitely would have read this novel, and I'm sure that's a parallel that he's setting us up for. So
Okay. Well, it's a nice little novel for other people who've enjoyed Suttree to go look at. What are you working on now?
So I have a few things, but mainly I have my first book is coming out in April. So it's called 4 Moments of Aesthetic Experience, reading Huysmans, Proust, McCarthy, and Cusk. And no, it's not Cormac McCarthy. It's actually the English novelist Tom McCarthy. So basically I have a chapter on each of those four novelists. And I guess the overall, much as we've spoken about in previous conversations, the overall kind of theme is aesthetic experience, and the title, 4 Moments of Aesthetic Experience, is kind of coming out of Kant's 4 moments of the aesthetic judgment. So I kind of see in my four example authors, different moments, so to speak. So not just instances of aesthetic experience, but like boundaries or qualifications or things like that. So that's been the main thing. I just turned in my final manuscript for that. Otherwise, just different articles. I am planning to write something on Cormac McCarthy pretty soon, hopefully. And as always, other things on Proust. I have just got a contract for an edited volume called Quiet Proust. So with James Dutton, who has a great book on Proust. He and I have put together a pretty great collection of contributors that we're going to start, working on that soon as well. So, yeah.
Nice. Well, I'll be sure to put the links for your own work and also the McCarthy articles that we've mentioned in the description below.
Awesome.
Bryan Counter, thanks very much.
Thank you.